displayed, and it is humbling to say the least to be part of that list now. I'm also really thrilled to be here at OSU. This is my first time to the campus, but I actually feel at home here, and I think that's maybe for two reasons. The first is that I'm from the Chicago suburbs, so I'm a Midwesterner at heart. But the second reason, which I guess is not the most publicly known, is that I think I sort of inadvertently demonstrated my unconscious affinity to the Buckeyes in the summer of 2004, when after, this is true, after just 5 days of classes at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, I dropped out. I decided to pursue my undergraduate studies elsewhere. All I needed was 5 days of instruction at that institution to know that I wasn't, there was something amiss up in Ann Arbor. And I have never been to this, it's true. So in any case, thank you again for the award, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. So this book is about international conflicts that turn out much differently than decision makers anticipate that they will. And a helpful illustration of this comes from the, here we go. Yeah. I'm leaving you in suspense about the case that I'm going to talk about.
Do you want me to run and get me?
It's all intentional. Yeah, I'm not sure about this. There we go.
There we go.
Yeah. The 1979 Sino-Vietnamese War. In the early months of this year, that year that is, Chinese national leaders approved a short but powerful invasion of their southern neighbor. And the logic that Deng Xiaoping and others, senior members of this Chinese Communist Party, based the invasion upon was relatively simple. China would teach the southern neighbor a lesson based upon a short-lived invasion that would demonstrate China's military prowess, akin to what China had done to India in the fall of 1962. Then China would simply withdraw its forces back across the border, having demonstrated how much stronger it was than its southern neighbor, and being able to extract coercive concessions from Hanoi in the future, knowing that Beijing was the stronger state. But the war actually ended up having the exact opposite effect from the perspective of decision makers in Beijing. Poor performance on the battlefield demonstrated China's military weakness rather than its strengths. As Vietnamese leader would later note, just shortly after the war, we know based upon material that's been released from the archives, they would say internally that it was not China who taught Vietnam a lesson, but rather Vietnam who taught China a lesson. Now, this distillation of the 1979 conflict illustrates an important, and I would argue, somewhat tragic point about the nature of war itself. Decision makers often charge headfirst into conflicts that ultimately fail to deliver benefits that they anticipate. Indeed, the benefits that they fought were the very foundation of the reason that they initiated the conflict in the first place. And this sort of mismatch between expectation and outcome often leads decision makers, as well as us academics, to question or probe, with the benefit of hindsight, would those decision makers have made a different set of decisions had they had access to a different set of information about what the future would hold? In the context of the US invasion of Vietnam, for example, numerous senior US decision makers would later reflect on just how inaccurate their views of the time were. Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, in his memoirs famously claimed that the United States was wrong, terribly wrong. Similarly, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, in an unpublished memoir that is available for consumption in the JFK archives in Boston, Massachusetts, put the point more precisely based upon the logic of the escalation. The spread of communism in Asia, according to Bundy, was, quote, could have been contained just about as well as it was at much lower cost, end quote. So this leads to the central puzzle or central question of this book, which is why do states miscalculate on the road to war? As political scientists and historians, we are immediately drawn to this answer that I alluded to a second ago, that while hindsight might be 20/20, a decision maker's view at the time when they're deciding between war and peace is often blurry. As a result, we might be tempted to conclude that given the pervasive nature of uncertainty in the international environment, what some refer to as the fog of war, sometimes things are going to go wrong and much differently than what you expect, no matter what you do. This book reaches a somewhat different conclusion. Some level of unanticipated failure is certainly unavoidable, but over time, states do better and worse depending on how they choose to design institutions for foreign policy decision-making. Some institutions that I'm going to talk about today perform better than others at delivering more complete and more accurate information, and that shapes patterns of conflict that we observe in the real world. Now, my book centers around a particular set of formal and informal institutions that shape the propensity for miscalculation, those regulating the relationship between political leaders on the one hand, think presidents, prime ministers, or even dictators, and their diplomatic, defense, and intelligence bureaucracy on the other. This book is certainly not the first to discuss the role of bureaucracy in foreign policy decision-making. A tradition dating back to one of my advisors in graduate school, Graham Allison's work in the 1970s, has explored this topic in significant detail. But if there is a single conventional wisdom in this body of work, I would argue that it is integrating bureaucracy into decision-making tends to muck things up. It degrades decision-making processes and delivers biased information to leaders. Or as the colloquial saying goes, a camel is a horse designed by a committee. My argument, however, is that we have this quite wrong. Democratic participation in decision-making is actually quite helpful in avoiding miscalculation, particularly when institutions channeling this participation are properly designed. First, and this is essentially for two reasons. First, bureaucracy provides leaders with access to more information than any single human could have or collect on their own. And critically, putting bureaucracies with competing interests and perspectives in dialogue with one another, specifically defense and diplomatic bureaucracies, what I'm going to talk about today, forces debate and deliberation that improves information quality to which the leader has access. This leads to the title of the book, that putting bureaucracies at war at home helps prevent miscalculation on the road to wars abroad. And to be clear, this isn't the only reason that states miscalculate. But I show this logic of institutional miscalculation as far more common than the literature has previously acknowledged. Of course, this naturally leads to a question of, well, why would leaders adopt anything but the institutions that are optimal from the perspective that I'm describing to you? And the second half of the book offers an answer that's rooted in domestic politics, domestic political survival. My argument is that leaders face a kind of trade-off in terms of the optimal institutional design. Institutions that deliver high-quality information allow bureaucrats to gain access to information, to build expertise, and to garner authority with which they can punish political leaders. That is, institutions that are effective from the perspective of foreign policy decision-making can also be a political liability for presidents, prime ministers, and even dictators to stay in office. Leaders resolve this trade-off based upon their political environment. When leaders see the bureaucratic state as a threat to their continuation in office, their agenda, institutions become inefficient from the perspective of decision-making, and those that even lead to miscalculation do become efficient from the perspective of politics. So putting these two components together, the book suggests that miscalculations on the road to war more holistically are often the result of this kind of tragic domestic political incentives pushing leaders to adopt institutions that are politically expedient, but nevertheless deprive them of quality information that leads them to choose war when they otherwise should not. So in the remainder of this talk, I want to sort of talk about three aspects of the book. The book has a number of empirical and theoretical parts to it. In terms of its theory, I want to lay out the theoretical framework, the sort of typology of the institutions that I'm drawing attention to today. The second, I want to give an overview of the case material holistically, just so you get a sense of what's in the book and what's covered. But then I want to dive deep into a paired comparison between institutions early in the reign of the People's Republic of China's first political leader, Mao Zedong, prior to 1962, and the decision-making that occurred after changed institutions leading up to the Cultural Revolution. Let's start off with the theory. The book begins with this kind of stylized idea that a leader is going to look out throughout the world and make choices about what they do in their foreign policy. It's not a terribly sort of controversial proposition, I don't think. In particular, it focuses on whether or not the leader is interested in initiating an international confrontation with another country. The leader could see this confrontation, be it a crisis or a conflict, as a pathway to help them advance their country's interests. But all else equal, they would prefer to avoid the cost of conflict or crisis if those conflicts or crises don't advance those interests that they have. Essentially, they have a type of prediction problem about the probable costs and benefits of confrontation they are contemplating. This calculation occurs in this framework when leaders choose a strategy based upon an inaccurate assessment about one of these basic parameters. Now, the choice that about how leaders have about international confrontation I argue is based upon, or is affected by this relationship between political leaders and national security bureaucracies. We can think about leaders doing the job of the sort of prediction task alone, sitting in the depths of the Oval Office, or in the case of China, Zhongnanhai. But leaders have another option to them. They do have bureaucracies, diplomatic, defense, and intelligence, on which they can lean. And so in this part of the argument, what I'm trying to accomplish is sort of thinking systematically about what the different types of institutions that regulate either leaders making choices on the one hand, or bureaucracies potentially supporting and advising them on the other might look like. One way of thinking about this is we already have a nomenclature or vernacular to talk about another important domestic political relationship, that between state and society. Think about the difference between democracy and autocracy. But when we think about bureaucratic institutions, we don't necessarily have the same kind of way of systematically thinking about why one country at one moment in time has a different set of institutions relative to another. Now, there are many ways in which these institutions could potentially differ from one another, but the typology that I introduced in the book posits that two critical dimensions can structure our thinking. That's the leader's information search capacity and the bureaucratic access to information. It's helpful, you could think about this in Cartesian terms. That first dimension, the leader's information search capacity, as a kind of vertical information flow, and that second dimension, bureaucratic access to information, as horizontal information flow, if we think about the state as a kind of organization or firm. Each of these dimensions exists on a continuum that can have higher or low values. And so in that first dimension, again, think vertical information flow, institutions can either be inclusive, easing the cost of information flow from bureaucrats to the leader and vice versa, or they can be insular, raising those same costs. The same is true for the second dimension. Institutions can be open, allowing information to flow freely across bureaucratic organizations as best as possible, or they can be closed, actually putting obstacles and impeding that horizontal information sharing I was talking about a second ago. These two dimensions will yield four institutional types. Again, think about this as the bureaucratic analog to describing the state as a democracy or an autocracy. So in the next few slides, again, this is just a typology, is purely descriptive, but we want to take this and think about the implications of each one of these cells, or three of them in particular, integrated, siloed, and fragmented, the ones I'm going to focus on today, on the risk of miscalculation as leaders choose between conflict and peace. So the core claim is that integrated institutions reduce the likelihood of miscalculation by supplying leaders with more complete and accurate information than they otherwise would have as they're choosing between war and peace. The intuition here is that there are transaction costs associated with searching for information within the state. Just because bureaucrats have a certain bit of information does not necessarily mean that leaders will have access to that bit of information when they're making those consequential and fateful choices, even though the leader has the power and authority over the bureaucrat, right? So there's a kind of functional problem that a leader has to solve. Leaders need tools to reach to the state and pull out the information that they need. In the book, I argue that the leaders can set formal and informal rules to lower these information search costs. One helpful way of illustrating this is to think about the design of a leader's advisory body for national security affairs, such as the National Security Council. We might be tempted to think that these bodies are kind of an oddity of the United States, but they're actually quite pervasive across the world. So for one example, you have here a meeting of the National Security Council in Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek's son, Jiang Jingbo. And the existence, as I said just a second ago, of these bodies, the appointment of bureaucratic representation on these representatives on these bodies, the commitments to use these bodies all establish formal and informal precedent that reduces those information search costs. Now, a second key part of the logic of integrated institutions, however, is that leaders want to design these institutions in ways that naturally facilitate deliberation. And after all, one core wisdom of the traditional bureaucratic politics model is that bureaucrats tend to be parochially biased. So integrating more bureaucrats into the room could pose just as it could simply expose leaders to lots of inaccurate information. So I argue that integration of two key bureaucratic constituencies helps to overcome these biases, as I alluded to at the beginning. Those are diplomatic and defense ministries. Now, the logic of this dialogue between diplomatic and defense ministers is twofold in terms of why it improves quality of information. First is that diplomatic and defense ministries tend to focus on different but equally important parts of a leader's choices on the road to war. Diplomatic ministries have access to information about the other side's political will and resolve, which could shape a leader's estimates of how willing the other side is to fight or to stick it out. Defense ministries, on the other hand, have unique information about the other side's material capabilities, which could shape a leader's projections about the probability of winning on the battlefield. The second reason that this diplomatic defense dialogue is important in integrated institutions is that diplomatic and defense ministries tend to attract and perhaps socialize people to different ways of viewing the world, different perspectives on international politics. So in other words, I show that defense ministries, for example, tend to be filled with individuals displaying more hawkish attitudes on foreign policy. That is, they tend to emphasize the efficacy and appropriateness of using violence as a means to solve international disputes. Diplomatic ministries, on the other hand, tend to emphasize or exhibit less hawkish worldviews, emphasizing the efficacy and appropriateness of diplomatic engagement. That is all else equal. So this logic of integrated institutions is that this competitive dialogue, this diplomatic defense dialogue, allows each side not only to complement each other's information, that's the kind of functional portion of the argument, but also to set up deliberative interactions in which each side is naturally situated to poke holes in the other side's arguments. Members of Eisenhower's National Security Council referred to this, for example, a relatively integrated institution, as an acid bath that information would have to pass through as it was being passed up to the president. There's a kind of strategic logic here as well, as we know in academia, when it's the case that you know other people are checking your work, in this case it would be defense and diplomatic advisors, there's less willingness to strategically, less willingness to intentionally bias information in ways that might suit parochial interests. So the kind of logic of integrated institutions out of the way, and again, this is the upper left-hand quadrant of the cell. I want to briefly talk about two other institutions which the book argues raise the risk of miscalculation. If integrated institutions lower the risk, but these other two variants raise it, but according to two different theoretical logics. And so this is siloed institutions and fragmented institutions. So let's start with fragmented ones, but with a bit of a faster clip. The book makes the case that both siloed and fragmented institutions raise the risk of miscalculation by supplying leaders with less complete and accurate information as they decide between peace and conflict. In a siloed institution, while rules and institutions make it easier for bureaucrats to pass information up to the leader, they are still systematic barriers to bureaucratic access to information horizontally across the state. In other words, what one bureaucracy knows or has possession of will not necessarily make its way over to another. This does two things that raises the risk of miscalculation. First, bureaucrats can't poke holes in information that they don't have access to. So a lack of this direct dialogue and debate means that leaders are left with only their personal judgment to determine whether bureaucrats who are often competing or providing conflicting information, whether or not they are leading them astray. And second, building on the logic or the strategic dimension of integrated institutions I just referenced, because bureaucrats know that no one is going to poke holes, they might be tempted to intentionally bias information in ways that suit their parochial interests. A helpful illustration of this logic of siloed institutions comes from the 1999 Kargil War. So for those who are not familiar, in the early months of 1999, Pakistan quietly moved military forces across the line of control in Kashmir in order to secure control of this part of the territory known as Kargil. This action triggered a major military retaliation by India and started the only war that's ever been fought between two nuclear-armed powers. Now, what's so puzzling about the Kargil War is that the initiator, Pakistan, got very little in exchange for the tremendous risk of fighting, not to mention the cost on the battlefield that it paid, and risking a potentially nuclear escalation. The war failed to change territory, the territory that Pakistan had controlled by the end of the fighting. Pakistan lost somewhere between 200 and 700 soldiers during the course of the conflict. The war pushed India to become closer in its relations with the United States, and responsibility for the war's outcome actually became the centerpiece for Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, depicted here on the left, and his removal from office later that year via coup. So this argues that, contrary to the conventional wisdom, the Kargil War was actually not the result of autonomous military actions. Sharif was indeed briefed on the military operation at multiple points in the winter and spring of 1999. Instead, Sharif's problem was twofold. First, Sharif desperately needed was desperately dependent on advisors to understand the intricacies of the situation that he faced in Kashmir. As one of Sharif's advisors, the foreign secretary at the time, told me during fieldwork that I did in Pakistan, quote, a leader's mind is made by his advisors, referring to Sharif's decision-making at the time. Second, Sharif's advisory bodies were highly siloed between the defense arm and the diplomatic. The bureaucratic structure afforded both the foreign ministry and the defense ministry access to the leader, but had few mechanisms to force information sharing horizontally between them. And as a result, while there were dissonants within the foreign ministry who were skeptical of such a military operations, limits on the foreign minister and foreign secretary's knowledge of what the military was supplying up on its side meant that they didn't know how important that information that they possessed was for Sharif to hear. At least until it was too late. So moving on to fragmented institutions, the logic here is that miscalculation is also raised by fragmented institutions, actually even more than siloed ones, according to a somewhat different logic. In a fragmented institution, leaders put up systematic barriers to bureaucratic participation in decision-making. This could be either through shutting down the advisory bodies, making those bodies more insular, or refusing to appoint defense or diplomatic ministers, or purging the bureaucracy itself. Again, thinking about this as low vertical information flow between the bureaucracy and the leader. Put differently, in extreme, we are back to the stylized world in which we started, a leader making decisions on foreign policy matters on their own. If the theory's core contention is right, this should raise the risk of miscalculation for two reasons that parallel the logic of integrated institutions. First, it means that leaders only have access to the information that they are personally able to gather, which suggests there are going to be gaps in what they know, because human beings can't collect all the information that's available in the international environment. And second, there are some reasons to think that this approach, this fragmented design, makes things even worse, because some advisors will be left behind, and the purging of the bureaucracy, the restrictions of the institutional design itself, will incentivize the provision of information that confirms leaders' prior beliefs. In other words, the individuals that are left behind have incentives to become sycophantic. Now, we might think about this as just a function of personalist dictatorships, but the book shows that this type of institutional arrangement can actually emerge in multiple political contexts, including institutionalized democracies. Specifically, the chapter on the United States makes the case that a series of changes to the National Security Council design under Lyndon Johnson in the early years of his administration made the United States a remarkably fragmented setup, particularly in comparison to the administrations that had preceded it under Eisenhower and Kennedy. And to try to show you that this is not a kind of just anecdotal interpretation of events, what I did was collected data from the Presidential Daily Diary. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Presidential Daily Diary is a log of all the president's meetings for every day that they're in office, organized chronologically. We can, based upon the start and end dates of each of those meetings, catalog the amount of face time that different bureaucratic organizations had with the president relative to other peers. And so what you have here is all of the face-to-face interactions that Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson had with 5 buckets of national security advisors, those for the State Department, Defense Department, the National Security Council, the JCS, and the CIA. So in particular, Johnson's rejiggering of the National Security Council put into effect this thing called a Tuesday luncheon, which supplanted in many ways what we would refer to as the National Security Council meeting or the Principals Committee meeting in the modern system. What this meant is that the senior military advisors in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's I think the second from the right of the box plots, as well as intelligence advisors in the CIA, had limited access because they were consistently pushed out of those meetings in that forum. So we see here a really significant drop, both in the JCS access and the CIA's access relative to what had been the case under both Eisenhower and Kennedy. What's really interesting about this process and this institutional design choice is that strategic logic that I alluded to a second ago really played out amongst lower level bureaucrats who observed the way that Johnson was changing the system. It's very rare that we get individuals in memoirs talking in counterfactual terms, but Chester Cooper, who was the NSC staff officer for Vietnam in this period, puts it precisely in that way. How does he do this? So he describes the meetings that he did eventually have with Johnson. They were rare, but he sometimes got access or was in the room. And Lyndon Johnson had this kind of routine where at the end of the meeting, after they arrived at a decision that the Tuesday luncheon had already sort of ratified or agreed upon, we go around the room and say, Mr. X, do you agree? Mr. Y, do you agree? Mr. Z, do you agree? And Chester Cooper recalls these interactions, one in particular where he has, and this is his term, a Walter Mitty-like fantasy. If you know Walter Mitty, it's this short story by James Thurber in which you have this kind of middling, I think he works as an insurance salesman or something like that, but sort of a middling job, but has these daytime fantasies where he would think about being a superhero or being a spy agent. So he would describe these mental images that he would have as Johnson is going around the room asking, do you agree with this? Do you agree with this? Do you agree with this? Standing up to the president and saying, Mr. President, no, I do not agree based upon my best estimate of the situation. But when Johnson got there, he would snap out of it and find himself saying, yes, Mr. President, I agree. One way of thinking about this, I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with the concept of groupthink, but this is a kind of institutionally derived groupthink. A groupthink that arises based upon the incentives that have been communicated to advisors in the bureaucracy below, in this case, the president. So now I want to try to illustrate the theory's intuition with some of the book's case evidence. This isn't the only methodology that the book employs, and I have other sort of ways of taking a bite out of the apple in other parts of my research agenda. So for example, the book has a cross-national data collection chapter where it tries to code these bureaucratic institutions across time and space since the mid-20th century and try to assess institutional performance in international crises based upon those data. It also includes these cases from 4 case countries, India, Pakistan, and the United States. And here are these countries where the empirical goal of choosing these countries was to try to unpack in decision-making in country contexts that don't normally are not normally considered in this part of the discipline. If we sort of think back to the work of Graham Allison, Jost who came after them, the majority of the work on bureaucratic politics tended to look at both the United States and to a certain extent Western Europe, sometimes Israel, but not countries far beyond that. So that was the kind of first reason for choosing these cases. But there was a second reason as well, and that is that we get good institutional variation within the same political regime. So in the case of China, we have a single-party authoritarian regime. We actually get variation along these bureaucratic lines within both the personalist phase of it under Mao Zedong, as well as the more collective rule dictatorship, if you're familiar with the framework of Barbara Geddes and Jessica Weeks. In India, you have a parliamentary democracy. Pakistan transitions between military rule and parliamentary democracy. And then the United States, a presidential democracy. So in the remainder of the time, I want to use the case of institutional changes in China under Mao Zedong to try to illustrate what the logic of the theory is doing. And to preview, there are 3 things that I try to show in each one of these historical cases. The first is that there was a dramatic shift, or try to get a measure of the institutional type, right? So we want to be able to say that the country is in a more integrated or more siloed or more fragmented period. I do this in the book by looking both at the formal design of institutions. So this is like organizational records of the Chinese Communist Party. But I also look at informal patterns or routines of bureaucratic behavior, which can be sort of demonstrated through, for example, the Lyndon Johnson's rejiggering of the NSC, which changed face time with bureaucratic advisors. In terms of measuring institutional performance, we're going to look both at the quality of leaders' assessments and projections versus the outcome that is actually observed, and then the logic of information provision that bureaucrats might express either at the time or subsequently. So to preview, there's going to be 3 things that I want to show in this specific case, comparing the early Mao period and the late Mao period. The first is that there was this pretty important change, domestic political threat that Mao perceived from the foreign policy bureaucracy beginning in the early 1960s. The second was that this threat led Mao to shift from an integrated design to a fragmented one. And finally, that this shift to explain some of the miscalculations that China had during the fragmented period, that subsequent period. Okay. So let's start with Mao's early political environment. As everyone likely knows, Mao sort of entered office in 1949 with really absolute political power over the system. This is based upon firsthand accounts, the description of him as a very charismatic leader, as well as the way in which a 1943 ratification campaign within the party had established his firm dominance over things. This leaves Mao with a very low level of threat observed from the foreign policy bureaucracy through the first decade of his rule. As late as the summer of 1962, Mao notes internally that he is generally pleased with both the foreign ministry and the People's Liberation Army. So Mao's domestic political environment was associated with a comparatively integrated institutional design. And one formal indication of this is the organizational membership of one key advisory body, the Political Bureau, and we could do the same sort of exercise for the Central Military Commission, another important body at the time. So if we look here, so this is data taken from the CCP's organizational records listing the membership of the Politburo. We find members of both the defense community and Zhou Enlai, both the premier and foreign minister of China at the time. We can also see this informally as well. One thing that I did for the chapters on Mao and Deng was collect records from the CCP archives, which are kind of analogous to the presidential daily diary. So again, these are called Nianpu, chronicles, but they list out for each day of a leader's time in office, who they met with, what they discussed during those meetings, and who else was, whether or not there was information provided. And so what we find when we look closely at the period between roughly 1949 and 1962 is that there was frequent interaction between Mao and foreign policy advisors of both defense and diplomatic type. Multiple times in which we're talking about the times in which these meetings of the Politburo or formal meetings of the Politburo provide advisors opportunities to send up reports. And this was definitely by design in Mao's terms. So in 1953, for example, there's a specific instruction that comes from Mao that sets precedent for the defense minister, Peng Dehuai, and chief of army staff, Huang Keng, to provide outlines of military plans and activities from the Central Military Commission once or twice a month to other members of the Politburo. Sort of think about this opposite of what we observed in the Kargil War. So the 1962 mainland invasion scare, a relatively poorly known or less well-known crisis of the early 1960s, is a helpful episode that sort of illustrates the way in which this relatively integrated design provided Mao with relatively complete and relatively accurate information at many points, including. So in the spring of 1962, for those of you who are not familiar with these events, Chiang Kai-shek, the individual depicted here, began planning for a military operation targeting the mainland. Chiang noted in his diary that there was, quote, clear proof that the support for the communist regime was waning in this is sort of 4 years into the Great Leap Forward. He also writes in 1962 that this is, quote, his only favorable opportunity for an offensive to take back control of the country. Chiang, as a result, doesn't just draw up military plans, he sort of rejiggers his own national security organizations, establishing a National Recovery Operation Office, as well as a Battlefield Administration Bureau, and begins holding meetings frequently with his military inner circle to try to push forward. Mao, on the other side of the Taiwan Strait, receives early warning of these developments through military intelligence channels, and he immediately begins tasking the bureaucracy to draw up plans and assessments. And again, the sort of institutional setup is ready to go. There's debate within the Politburo, the Military Commission, and the Strategic Research Small Group. Both foreign ministry and defense representatives are participants in these deliberations. And the deliberation essentially comes up with a two-pronged strategy. First, there's going to be a PLA mobilization on the other side on the mainland side of the Taiwan Strait to try to deter a KMT invasion to send a signal to Chiang. But second, that the PRC would diplomatically engage with the United States in order to tease out the U.S. intentions. Now, the information from the foreign ministry in China was critical to Mao's decision-making in a few ways, particularly regarding the second point on the U.S. intentions. So first, individuals who were embedded in the foreign affairs bureaucracy noted that an invasion by Chiang was unlikely because the United States would not approve it in the heels of a Bay of Pigs invasion. And the U.S. approval was required according to the 1955 Mutual Defense Treaty between Washington and Taipei in order for Chiang to launch his operation. So in other words, if Kennedy were to put the brakes on things, which he was likely to do in the wake of the Bay of Pigs invasion, they would not go forward. So as such, Foreign Minister Chen Yi in internal cables that are going up to Mao at the time says that it was more likely that, quote, Chiang Kai-shek has ignored US restraints, end quote, and that Kennedy would not dare take the risk in actuality. As a result, the foreign ministry encourages diplomatic engagement in the summer of 1962 with the United States to try to gauge US willingness to support a KMT attack, sort of saying, well, it's possible, it's unlikely that the United States would be behind this, but we have other channels at our disposal to try to tease that out. Specifically, the PRC foreign ministry representative in Warsaw, again, think this is 1962, this is before rapprochement. The United States and China don't even have formal diplomatic ties, but they do have a channel in Warsaw by which at the ambassador level, diplomats can engage with one another. And the PRC engages its diplomatic representative there, Wang Bingnan, to meet with US Ambassador John Cabot on June 23rd. And during the meeting, Wang receives the message that the United States, quote, had no intention of supporting a KMT attack. And on this side, you actually see the record from the Chinese Foreign Ministry Archive recounting that meeting. We also have the record from the US side. But what's really key here is that what we see on the right-hand side of the slide is not just the content, but rather the distribution list, so to speak, the CC line of this cable within the CCP apparatus. And for those of you who speak Chinese, you'll see it's relatively all-encompassing, right? So we see individuals ranging from Zhu Xi, who is the chairman, so that's going to be Mao, but on down the line, all the senior members of the Politburo, and then critically, key members of the PLA General Staff, as well as, if you happen to know the history of the Chinese intelligence arm, Kong Yuan, who is the head of the internal CID, the antecedent to the Ministry of State Security, China's version of the CIA, is on the CC line as well. So interestingly, Wang Bingnan was able to publish memoirs after all of this, and says that this cable, this interaction, was not only made its way all the way up to Mao, but was important. In part, he knows that was the case because they called him multiple times to try to clarify what exactly Cabot told them during the meeting. So now we want to try to compare this interaction in 1962 with some of the interactions that Mao had with his advisors subsequent to that. In particular, in the fall just after the mainland invasion scare with Taiwan, Mao begins to contemplate his own death. What will happen after I die is a quote that we have from the summer of 1962. And that conclusion, or that sort of contemplation of Mao's passing or his own mortality, and his sort of projections of what will happen with the bureaucracy after that is informed in many ways by the previous 4 years and the domestic political calamity of the Great Leap Forward. Namely, Mao takes the events of the Great Leap Forward as a premonition that the party will become less revolutionary after he is no longer with them to push them in that direction. And as a result, in the beginning of the fall of 62, and with elevated clip as China moves towards the Cultural Revolution in 1965 and 66, Mao increasingly sees the bureaucracy as a threat to his legacy and the Chinese Revolution writ large. We see this in Mao's frequent discussion of, quote, revisionism within the party. In May 1963, for example, Mao expresses concern that China will change its revolutionary color. In October of that same year, he notes that, quote, measures must be taken to curb the risk of such internal changes. Moreover, what is unique about Mao's domestic threat perceptions in the early 1960s, or mid-1960s rather, is that he sees an international dimension to the fading revolutionary color of the regime, likely colored by this ideological competition that China is in with the Soviet Union at the time. This puts the foreign affairs bureaucracy squarely in Mao's sights in ways that they had not been in the past. As early as the fall of that year, Mao comments in internal memoranda to the foreign ministry that diplomats need to pay attention to, quote, the connection between revisionism at home and abroad. And during the Three Winds campaign during that same year, Mao targets a Chinese diplomat, Wang Jiaxiang, this individual is shown here for one of the purges, the first purge of the foreign affairs system, which will become pervasive by the time the revolution begins. Of course, it's an understatement to say that the targeting of this one individual in the fall paled in comparison to what happened to the foreign ministry by 1967. Mao's changing perceptions of the bureaucratic threat faced dramatically reshaped China's institutional design, moving it to a more fragmented structure. First, Mao shifts his decision-making forum from one of largely inclusive in the Politburo to one that is exclusive in the Politburo Standing Committee. There's no diplomatic representation in that higher level body. This institutional choice has a really important effect on bureaucratic access to the leader. In this figure, we see, again, the sort of quantification of those data I showed you earlier, those or chronicle documents. Again, think of this as sort of the analog to the presidential daily diary data. And you see Mao's interactions with the foreign affairs teams. In the left-hand, in the left-hand panel, the forum in which he's meeting with foreign affairs teams. And in the right-hand panel, who is present in those meetings? Either diplomats in light gray, military in dark gray, or both in that kind of more whitish color. What we see in the period leading up to the Cultural Revolution and then the early Cultural Revolution, so the dates for those are 1963 to 1965 and 1966 to 1969, is a dramatic decrease in both meetings in which both diplomats and military bureaucrats are present in the room, and in particular diplomats, right? The diplomatic ministry just gets crushed during the Cultural Revolution. This winnowing of connective tissue is actually part of a broader purge of the foreign affairs system. So party organizational records suggest that roughly 70% of foreign ministry personnel stationed in Beijing were sent down to the countryside to learn from the peasantry, and all but one of Chinese ambassadors were recalled to Beijing to participate in the domestic political campaign. Mao's subordinates sort of in retrospect noted that they dare not suggest changes in Chinese foreign policy after these institutional changes were made. So in contrast to those events of 1962, I want to instead talk now about the events leading up to the Sino-Soviet border conflict of 1969. Again, providing a helpful illustration of how things work once you shift to a more fragmented system. As a bit of background, on March 2nd, 1969, Chinese forces stationed in the northeastern part of China along the Soviet border launched an ambush on Soviet forces conducting a patrol there. Jost, who approved the operation, his choice was based upon three assessments. First, Mao believed that the Soviet Union would not escalate in response. On the contrary, Mao intimated that an attack would be viewed defensively in Moscow. As Mao put it, and this is actually in the archival record, quote, "The Soviets know that we will not invade their country as it is so cold there." Number two, Mao believed that the Soviet Union was contemplating a preemptive attack on China. Orders from Beijing in 1967, for example, noted that the Soviet leadership had, quote, inherited a czarist ambition of securing a sphere of influence along China's border. And third, Mao concluded that there were few potential policy alternatives available to him at the time. In particular, Mao did not believe that the time is yet right for a closer relationship with the United States that China might use as a kind of a blunting force against a potential Soviet attack. Yet the evidence now available, including archival records declassified by the Soviet Union, as well as Brezhnev's own diary, archival material from the United States, suggest that all three assessments were inaccurate. First, despite Mao's premonitions about the weather, the Soviet Union quickly escalated the conflict as a result of the ambush counterattacking in the northeastern front later that month and opening up another front in Xinjiang, the western part of the country, in August. They also issued veiled nuclear threats in the fall of 1969 that led Mao to evacuate the capital. Second, there's actually little evidence from Soviet records, including Brezhnev's own diary, that the Soviet Union was contemplating a preemptive attack on Beijing before the Chinese ambush. In fact, it was only after Mao approves the attack that the leadership in Moscow begins to seriously consider military action towards China. In other words, Mao causes the outcome that he had hoped to try to prevent. And third, I would argue that Mao misread the United States. Nixon, as early as February of 1969, the archival material makes clear, was actually keenly interested before coming into office in rapprochement with China. That is, Nixon was open to rapprochement even before Mao orders the ambush of Soviet troops. Now, we might be tempted to think about these miscalculations as all inevitable, as I sort of opened the entire talk with. After all, uncertainty pervades international politics, so maybe Mao did the best that he could with the information that was available in the international environment at the time. But there's actually considerable evidence to suggest that the story is not so simple. Information was available within the Chinese bureaucracy that contradicted each one of these three assessments that Mao made, but that information failed to reach Mao. For example, Chinese diplomats appear to have assessed that the international situation did not favor a Soviet invasion of China at the time, but bureaucrats resisted supplying this information to Mao. As noted by several senior bureaucrats in the spring of 1969, it would, quote, be easier said than done to propose a, quote, different way of thinking, even when Mao was requesting information and new analysis from the bureaucracy. One helpful illustration of a functional impediment to information flow inside the Chinese system at this time is from this man, Wang Guoquan, who replaced Wang Bingnan, the Chinese ambassador in Warsaw, present in the 1962 talks, and an interaction that he had with the United States in 1967. So it's actually the case that in face-to-face interactions with the United States that Wang was present at, that he observed, even before Nixon comes into office, so this is the last years of the Johnson administration, the United States beginning to be interested in a more normal relationship with the PRC. He picks up on this as a kind of first hint that there might be a rapprochement in the offing. Again, this is in 1967, not in 1969, 2 years before the invasion. But again, speaking to Mao's third judgment that I talked about it a second ago. However, and this is unusually candid in the political environment of China, Wang in his memoirs says that the reason that signal that he received in Warsaw in 1967 didn't have an effect on decision-making back in Beijing was precisely the way in which the dysfunction of the Cultural Revolution and the institutional design that Mao had adopted by the Cultural Revolution inhibited kind of normal incorporation of that information. So to reiterate, the cases like the ones that I've just presented to you offer these kind of illustrations of the theory's logic, but they're not the only way to study miscalculation through this institutional mechanism. The book evaluates institutional performance across all international crises to which China was party, and the two chapters focus on China. It applies the same procedure to other case countries that I talked about and draws on that cross-national data set to evaluate crisis performance across the world since the end of World War II. The point here is just to show that there's a number of different ways to probe the theoretical intuitions of what the book is trying to say. This book is also part of a broader research agenda that is trying to exploit different sources of data that might be more rich in other countries or more rich in other time periods to try to illustrate some of the that I've talked about today. So you might have wondered, is it really the case that the deliberations unfold in the manner that I just described? And while China hasn't responded to my freedom of information requests, other work that I have sort of relies upon a big data approach of archival records in the United States to help validate how deliberations can potentially work. You might also have wondered whether the cables that I alluded to a second ago between Wang Bingnan and Wang Guoquan were really systematic patterns of information provision from the embassies back to Beijing. This is a question that I'm exploring in a working paper with Eric Min. You might also have wondered, as Trump has been saying a lot these days, that people are policy. So who people are might tell us a lot about what information actually gets generated. And so to try to get at the kind of human face of bureaucracy and work with Dan Mattingly on the PLA, as well as one of our great graduate students at Brown University, Yu Tongli, I've sort of been looking at individual level data of both the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military on the one hand, and the foreign ministry on the other. But this agenda is all sort of linked back to the central point of the book, that the relationship between bureaucracy and miscalculation might need revision. And that when properly designed, bureaucracy can potentially be an asset rather than a liability for a leader's decision-making, even if domestic politics, unfortunately, sometimes get in the way of that. So thank you so much for your time and attention today. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Very much for this. We have not quite a half an hour for Q&A, and I'm going to abuse my privilege and ask the first question while you all collect your thoughts. This is absolutely astounding, amassing evidence of a very elegant kind of model that I think clearly provides very good advice to leaders. What strikes me, however, is that you do assign an awful lot of agency to leaders in their ability to design their own institution. And this is surprising if you have grown up watching Yes Minister. It might also be surprising, thinking in the US about current administration in which there is a very concerted effort to redesign both security institutions and institutions in general. And they're finding, first of all, that it's a bigger job than they thought it was. And secondly, they are getting a lot of pushback. So I understand for the sake of theory, then you have to kind of flatten that description of the institution. But I'm wondering about variation in actual cases about how the sort of endeavor to channel information is interacting with the legacies of prior institutional designs.
Yeah, so it's absolutely the case. It almost certainly must be true that institutions have a kind of path dependence element to them that could push designs in ways that were, that T minus one is going to have an effect. I think two things have to be true about the world in order for this theory to capture something important. The first is that decisions about war and peace leaders have to have a dominant say over those choices. I find that empirically to be the case in most of the cases that I looked at, as well as just my read on the crises of the second half of the 20th century and since the end of the Cold War. It's not to say that Congress is not important or that legislatures, parliament in India is not important. But when it comes for the final say, Truman had that saying that the buck stops here. Leaders do tend to have an outsized effect on what is ultimately chosen. So then the question becomes, okay, if they have a choice about war and peace, do they also have a choice about what the institution looks like at the very apex, right, where the leader meets the bureaucracy? So bureaucracies are huge organizations, often states are huge entities. And they only come into contact with the political leader typically at the very top. And so what has to be true about the model is that the leader has also an outsized ability to shape the rules that govern his personal interactions with the rest of the bureaucracy. So there might be a lot of restrictions on a leader's ability to doge a bureaucratic organization, to purge I don't mean to equate those two necessarily, but in the case of Mao, to purge a bureaucracy, that might be more difficult to do in the United States than it is for Lyndon Johnson to shift decision-making from the NSC as a forum to the Tuesday luncheon. And it is, I find to be the case that leaders do actually, whether we like it or not, it's hard to force them to sit down in a particular forum when they're making decisions because they ultimately get to decide. Yes, sir.
Peter Montour from the Department of History.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to meet you. No, I'm sorry. I didn't know that
So
I totally threw you. You have to write.
I was going to ask the most funny question ever.
staying in 3 of the 4 boxes. You explained 2 of them, and the integrated system is pretty straightforward. Can you talk about the upper
right-hand corner? Yeah.
And maybe give an example.
Yeah, so if we're thinking in Cartesian terms, what we're talking about is an organizational system in which there's little vertical information flow, but the leader permits for some reason horizontal information flow, right? And the book makes the case and tries to show empirically that for 2 theoretical reasons, it doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense to design a state that way. And indeed, it's the case empirically that these are just quite rare. Like, I think Thailand is one of the cases in the 1970s that happens to pop up according to the measurement strategy that the cross-national data chapter applies. But the central, if you think about leaders as having to set up, as it being costly to set up standard operating procedures that force bureaucracies that want to hold on to their information to share it with other information. So that's a costly endeavor. If the primary motivation of leaders trying to get to do that is to force deliberation between them, to kind of force synergy so that when it makes its way up, better, then if the information isn't flowing up, you have less incentive to try to force information sharing horizontally. Now, that assumes that the primary function of these institutions is advisory, which is probably, this is certainly a simplification. We could think about, and this is the reason why I call them dictatorial, there could be situations in which these same routines could be used to try to coordinate bureaucratic action even though the bureaucracy is going to have no input into what the leader ultimately decide. So you could think about it as kind of like this, a perfectly personalist system in which the leader decides everything in a vacuum, and then the organization below them implements, to a T, and it's perfectly synergized, and that's the reason why horizontal information flow occurs. But it's not based upon an advisory logic. Yes.
Yeah, congratulations on the book and the award, by the way. Wonderful talk. Two quick questions, one conceptual and the other empirics. Conceptual questions, how do you define miscalculation, right? If it's simply a kitchen sink definition saying that whatever I didn't expect is miscalculation.
No, yeah.
That is, right.
Yeah.
So it relates to the fog of war story, right? So Alan Bayerchain famously claimed that fog of war, by the way that Clausewitz meant, is not really about the dearth of information, but really the overload of information, right? So in that logic, is really worried about having too much information rather than just lack of information that Jim Ferron assumed. So in that sense, I think the definition issue is important, right? The empirics question is really simple. How much of this is really domestic politics story, especially in the Maoist sense, right? Because Mao really likes to use foreign threats and crises as a way for his domestic legitimation for his revolutionary agenda, right?
Sure.
1958, Great Leap Forward, I scared Taiwan with bombing, right? Korean War, I want to launch a 3 anti-campaign. I want to use this as a way to do it, right? So this is typical story from Mao. So how much of this makes the informational part of the story less essential for Mao's decision-making, even though the information kind of flows up?
Yeah, there's a subtle distinction here. So in a domestic mobilization story, really what you're talking about typically is the relationship between state and society, right? Or, elites who might be responsible for supporting a political leader's policy, as was the case in 1958, right? So Tom Christensen's Useful Adversaries is a very compelling account of why this might be the case in the second Taiwan Straits crisis in 1958. So in an ideal world, what the leader would want to do, if they strictly have domestic political political motivations in mind, what you want to do is gin up a foreign crisis that is very carefully controlled so that you can mobilize population for a political purpose, right? But keep the bureaucracy as well-functioning and efficient as possible such that you can calibrate it perfectly, right? And so an interesting thing is that if you look closely at the records of 1958, Mao was actually in frequent dialogue with his bureaucratic advisors. Now, he's a domineering force, and there's elements of his personality that made him pretty tough to work for. All those things are true. But the interesting thing about 58 is it works pretty well. The same is not true of 69. It is brutally inefficient inside of the system. One example, we can talk offline about an example that happens during the nuclear war scare. In the fall of 69. Okay, so your first question was about the definition of miscalculation. So yes, it's important, and I'm glad you asked the question, and because I use the term miscalculation intentionally rather than misperception, because I see this as a slightly different argument, though related to Bob Jervis's kind of framework of just sort of seeing the world inaccurately. So here the idea is that strategic choice is based upon some inaccurate assessment the international environment. Now, you're absolutely right that even though the book puts a lot of emphasis on bad outcomes, it is theoretically possible that a poor reading or inaccurate assessments that inform a leader's choice could lead to positive outcomes on the battlefield, right? Perhaps you sort of are being too pessimistic about your military strength, and miscalculating in that sense could lead to a wonderful victory that otherwise would not. I think there are good reasons in political psychology, the sort of logic of egocentric reasoning and overconfidence that would suggest that if there is some bias, it's probably in the other direction. And then just in terms of making predictions about the future, right, it sort of makes sense that if those are off, it's probably going to be the case that on average, things will turn out worse for you than otherwise would. But you did have a second question sandwiched in between the first and third, and I'm drawing a blank on what exactly.
I don't even remember. I guess.
Yeah, so it was about the fog of war. Information overload. Yeah. Information overload is such an interesting. So it's such an interesting framework to start thinking about the problem of miscalculation. But I actually think we put too much emphasis on it, and here's the reason why, right? So think about the international environment, right? That contains some amount of information about the true state of the world. That doesn't change, right? Information overload refers to channeling too much of that information through, without a filtering process, up into the one human decision maker, such that they have a cognitive overload and can't compute at all. But the whole logic of intelligence organizations, bureaucratic organizations, these integrated institutions that I'm trying to describe to you, is that there needs to be a filtering process. And that filtering process can either be poor or not poor. And so the logic here is that integrated institutions do a better job of supporting that filtering process relative to alternatives. Alex.
In a way, this actually picks up on your last point. So you're in your talk, you emphasize diplomatic and military organizations. You don't really talk much about the intelligence community. So I guess I'm wondering why they're missing. And then secondly, is it the case that if you went back and looked at what the different agencies were recommending, did the IC tend to get it most right, or is that not the case?
The last question, I didn't score them that way. That is, thinking about it quickly, I don't think that is the case. So the reason that they're glossed over in the talk is purely a sort of a presentational shorthand. They're very much there in the book as one of the three key elements: diplomatic, defense, and intelligence. The logic of why intelligence organizations are important is less to do with function, because in most country apparatuses, the functional collection requirements in both foreign ministries and defense ministries tend to be duplicated in intelligence organizations. The reason the book argues that it's helpful to also have intelligence organizations is because, and this isn't always the case, but it's a strategic logic in which it is the case that diplomatic and defense bureaucracies are responsible for analysis, but they're also responsible for implementation, which creates a kind of potential for bias, because the things that you want to do could affect the things that you say are true about the world. What is generally true about intelligence organizations is that, with the exception of covert action and intelligence collection specifically, they don't duplicate those functions of either fighting on the battlefield or in diplomatic engagement. So it's a kind of third check with a completely different organizational incentive. And so it's the same logic of why you would want another person checking or another organization checking, akin to defense and diplomatic folks checking each other's work. But yeah, I just sort of gloss over it so I can get through it all. In the back.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful book and presentation. So it sounds like, by like information flows and communication, you need intelligence, but I was just thinking of whether intelligence of a time dimension and a technological dimension. If intelligence in the 60s is the same, can be compared with intelligence and if it can be compared across contexts. And you in your response earlier, you suggested that information about the world is fixed, and then there is miscalculation, or there isn't. But to push back on this, right? Because I mean, the explosion of like smartphones, internet. I mean, it's not really like and then AI. So like I don't know. Can technological change be of your story? And did you notice a difference in your work?
For the first question that you're asking, I'm going to ask a quick counter, but if you don't want to answer, that's fine. I'll provide a definition. This is your definition.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't have.
Okay. So here's how I like to think about it. I typically use the term information just because it refers to bits of information about the true state of the world. Intelligence is a kind of nomenclature of a particular type of information that's collected through certain channels, oftentimes covertly, oftentimes as we take people off or we listen in on phone conversations, so on and so forth. But really what we're interested in is information. Some of it's collected through those means, but diplomatic engagement that a foreign ministry has with another counterpart could be information that's informed a leader's choice. Similarly, analyses that militaries do about their own capabilities, that's a type of information that is important. So that kind of definitional question, I think about intelligence as a subset of information. But information is the thing that we're really after here, because it's not all intelligence choices. In terms of the explosion of technology and really our ability to see the world, you're absolutely right. What I meant a second ago is that at a fixed moment in time, right, there exists some amount of information in the world. Of course, that our ability to see that can, through technological means, increase over time. And like one way of thinking about that is like there's another dimension to a state's capacity to extract information. Here, it's the leader's ability to reach down into the state and pull up the information they need. But there's also this kind of like reaching out into the world and collecting information. You could think of that as a kind of capacity type argument, right? So in the 60s and 70s, this is like, well, how big is your covert collection capability? How many satellites do you have, so on and so forth. The really interesting thing, and I can't really speak to this because all my cases are sort of like, I think the last case, I know the last case, it's in 2001, 2002, way before the way that the internet and big data have transformed our society. What I can't speak to is the way in which that might just really put a lot of pressure on those filtering operations that I was talking about a second ago. It's possible that the volume of information that now exists within the world that can be like pulled out of it has gotten to a point where we need to rethink this. I don't have a theoretical reason to think that is the case, but it's possible.
Really great. I'm wondering if there's some downsides to the integrated strategy and what are some strategies for dealing with those downsides?
Yeah.
You know, when I think about the Carter experience with Brzezinski and Vance, you know, you
They were at
have,
each
you
other's
have a
throats.
lot of your competitive juices going, but leaking and sabotaging and there's all kinds of dysfunction. And you jump forward to the first Bush administration, Baker, Scowcroft, Cheney, they're much more in line. People are the bureaucracy at that level because you're up at the apex.
Yeah.
And that one, you know, seems to move more smoothly and they get things done. So I'm wondering, and then the second downside, I wonder about integrated strategy. After 9/11, we created the Director of Intelligence and we started integrating everything for obvious reasons. And now we're worried about the potential power that's aligned to invade civil rights and security, the surveillance state.
Sure.
Because you're enhancing the capacity to share information across bureaucracies that have very different legal authorities.
Yeah. I mean, that second point is such an important one. And there could be other moral or political reasons that you would want to restrict the access to information that go beyond this, right? I mean, it's a standard operating procedure inside of most intelligence organizations is, like, you know, compartmenting information to make sure it doesn't leak out too broadly, right? So that's one potential. But as you just said, like it could be the case that the state becomes too powerful and has access to too much information, and as a result, civil liberties are infringed upon. So that, I mean, it never came up as a consideration in institutional design of the cases that I looked at, but this was again before some of these other means of extraction were available, and for moral or normative reasons, you might think that is not a good policy to have. On your first question about the Carter administration, so you know this is a institutional story in the kind of North and Wine Gap tradition that captures one way of thinking about the interactions between politicians and bureaucracies, and one set of incentives that are largely agnostic to the players that are in those roles. What I think is probably the case is that a separate way of looking at this, which could be as important, I don't know, someone would have to do it, is that there is a human dimension to those deliberative interactions such that when people really don't like each other, the deliberation doesn't work as smoothly as the model is sort of suggesting it would. How that homophily arises is kind of, I think it's a complex process. It would be a really interesting area to dig into, because I think you're absolutely right. And the puzzle of the same under Bush 41 and Carter is an important one. Like, why is it the case that this personality gets in the way of good deliberation in Carter and doesn't, in fact, it's sort of like held up as the paragon of good deliberation in Bush 41. Perhaps a incomplete answer, but foreshadowing future research, perhaps. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. It felt really convincing, the conclusions anyway, but as a historian of LBJ, I want to pick a couple of nits at the process there. You put up that brilliant slide of the face-to-face meetings of the various institutions, except Johnson didn't believe in meetings. He lived on the telephone, which is why we had 900 hours of Johnson phone tapes. Now, as someone who has transcribed a lot of the tapes from 64, 65, I would tell you that he's getting pretty accurate information. Not only is he getting pretty depressing information in 64, 65, but it looks like it's sunk in. So we have the conversation he has with Bundy, I think it's March of 64. And he says, we're not going to send troops in there, are we?
Yeah.
Right. I think it's 65 with Russell, where he says, I just don't know how to get out.
Yeah.
So is it not possible that he's getting accurate information from the bureaucracy and it's having an effect? It's just coming through unconventional processes?
So I think there's two questions here. The first is about the procedure and the second is about the accuracy of the information. So I think 100% you're right. Johnson did rely upon phone conversations a lot. I can't show this with quantitative data. My impression, having looked at, because it was also true of the LBJ administration that the phone calls were often logged on the presidential daily diaries. The names that pop up on there are not those from the JCS, lower levels of the NSC or the CIA.
Right, but they're logged only when they're scheduled, when they're planned, when he's just randomly saying, hey, get Bundy on the phone.
Oh, I mean, that could be. I mean, but even within, because I've read the transcripts as well, again, those names, it's not as if like Dulles popped, I recall a single conversation with Dulles or McCone. Sorry, with McCone. So the procedural question I think is right, but my intuition is that it sort of bleeds over into that other informal route as well. The next question is, okay, was the information accurate? It's not one of the cases that I go into in the talk, other than to sort of briefly illustrate one of the logics. I try to, in very painstaking detail, show the ways in which, so you're probably familiar with it's October 6th, 1964, the famous ball memorandum. It's 64 pages, right?
Right, and then one from Humphrey not that long after that.
So Humphrey's in January of 65, January of 65. Although that in and of itself is a kind of interesting interaction, right? And talk about your own. So the story here, for those of you who don't know, the Vice President of the United States in January of 1965 writes a memorandum to Lyndon Johnson saying that, look, if there's any political moment to pull ourselves out of Vietnam, it's now, right? You just won. You won in a landslide. You have the political capital. Yes, you want to do great society. Yes, you want to do civil rights. But we'll get through it. You can do this. And oh, by the way, maybe he didn't say this, but maybe you can run in 68 too. And Lyndon Johnson not only doesn't heed his advice, but he excludes him from all subsequent meetings on foreign policy. I mean, it's really really a sad story. I mean, as is the case with all this, these decisions. It's same with now. It's tragic because people died. So in any case, we should talk offline. We're going nitty gritty here on the historiography, and I get the sense.
Maybe for one last question from a student.
Please, yeah. Yes, please.
Can you just talk maybe a little bit about why you chose 1962? I thought you were going to talk about the Sino-Indian War, or also a theory. It sounds like it's because Mao's power, or he feels a threat for power. But it seems like that maybe even happened earlier, really before, and so why sort of 62?
Well, I mean, so they're happening a couple months apart. Why did I do the mainland invasion scare as opposed to India? I think at the time there was just a cleaner archival record for the mainland invasion scare that I was able to get access to. There's an article that's come out with John Canterbury, International Security, where we were able to get more on both the Indian and Chinese side on the decision making for 62. I don't know in retrospect if I had access to that, or I would have done 60 Sino-India as a mainland invasion scare. But yeah, I do think it's a comparable process. Even though you're starting to get, by the fall of 62, you're starting to get the early whiffs of the Cultural Revolution, amongst the bureaucracy. That individual I showed you earlier, the head of the liaison department, he's purged, I think the month before the Sino Indian War. Don't quote me on that. Just a couple of months before the invasion against India.
For those of you who would like to talk more about China, please join us next week for Jeremy Wallace. But in the meantime, thanks very much for coming today, and many thanks to our speaker.
Thank you, President.